The driver's side window is all bashed in, and he's got blood all over his head.
In the peaceful suburb of Tallahassee, Florida, a shocking incident shattered the community. A well-liked university professor, Dan Markel, was found bleeding profusely on his own driveway, leaving the police with no leads, no suspects, and no DNA evidence. The only witness's account was vague at best, leaving the authorities with a difficult case to solve. This would be no easy task and would require all their skills, experience, and patience to uncover the truth. As we dive into this mystery, our thoughts are with Dan Markel's loved ones, whose lives were forever altered by his tragic and untimely demise. Dan Markel, born in Toronto, Canada in 1972, was an accomplished and brilliant individual who pursued an education at various universities, such as the University of Jerusalem, Cambridge, and Harvard, where he earned his law degree in 2001. After working as a clerk at a law firm for several years, Dan was presented with an irresistible opportunity in 2005. The Florida State University was in need of someone with Dan's expertise to work at their College of Law, and he gladly accepted the offer. His passion for teaching and criminal law made him the perfect fit for the position. In addition to teaching law classes, Dan wrote numerous papers on criminal law. His life took another turn when he met Wendy Adelson, his partner on a Jewish dating site. Wendy was 26 years old while Dan was 33, and they were both passionate about law. Wendy later followed in Dan's footsteps and taught law at Florida State University. It was a whirlwind romance that took Dan and Wendy by storm. They hit it off so well that they couldn't wait to get married. In a short period, they met, fell in love, got engaged, and got married on February 26, 2006. Both were living their dream lives, with their dream jobs, great incomes, and the arrival of their two sons in 2009 and 2010 made everything seem perfect. But as fate would have it, in 2012, their seemingly idyllic marriage hit a snag, and the couple separated. Details of their tumultuous split were kept under wraps, leaving everyone guessing about what could have caused the downfall of their once perfect union. Dan and Wendy, known for their dynamic and fast-paced lifestyles, wasted no time in finalizing their divorce in 2013. It goes to show that appearances can be deceiving, and what the world sees on the surface may not always reflect what goes on behind closed doors. For Dan and Wendy, their picture-perfect life was not as perfect as it seemed. Dan returned from a work trip, looking forward to being greeted by his loving wife and adorable children. But as he walked through the front door, he was met with an eerie silence. His heart sank as he realized that not only were his wife and kids nowhere to be found, but the entire house had been stripped bare. All that remained were a few meager belongings, including a mattress. Moving a house can be stressful, and it was clear that Wendy had not made this decision overnight. She had been planning this for a long time, and the extent to which she had stripped the home bare was a reflection of just how sour their marriage had turned. But that wasn't all. On top of the mattress, Wendy had left a stack of divorce papers, signaling the beginning of a tumultuous and bitter divorce process. It was clear that Wendy had an axe to grind and was determined to make Dan's life as difficult as possible. Throughout the process, she seemed to relish in doing anything she could to hurt him. In fact, Dan described the divorce as a Pearl Harbor-style separation, an apt description of the devastation and destruction that had been wrought upon their once loving marriage. Wendy was on a mission to erase Dan Markel from her and her children's lives, and she was not holding back. In a move that seemed vindictive and callous, she changed their children's surnames to her own, and even went so far as to change one of their middle names, which had been given as a tribute to one of Dan's deceased relatives. She was conducting the separation with a scorched earth mentality, wiping away any trace of Dan from their lives. Co-parenting can be a difficult and delicate process, but Wendy seemed determined to cut Dan out of their children's lives completely. Her actions were heartless and cruel, and it was hard to understand how a mother could do this to her own children. Fast forward to 2014, and both Dan and Wendy were getting on with their separate lives, with access to their sons. Wendy had turned to writing. Wendy wrote a book on human trafficking laws, but her writing style fell short compared to Dan's, resulting in a colossal failure. The book received scathing reviews, branding it as extremely poor, and it seemed like no one wanted to read it. On July 18th, Dan followed his usual routine of picking up the kids from Wendy's house and dropping them off at preschool. He also went to the gym and ran a few errands. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary until he arrived home at 11 a.m. As he pulled up to his driveway, he noticed an unknown person waiting for him. Although the identity of the person Dan was speaking to on the phone was not disclosed, this individual did report the conversation to the authorities. The person waiting for Dan had planned an ambush and wasted no time initiating it. Without warning or dialogue, a bullet was mercilessly fired through his driver's side window. The force of impact was so great that his head was thrown back against the headrest. A neighbor who heard the gunshot rushed to the scene and was met with a grisly sight. Dan sat lifelessly in the driver's seat, his face and the car's interior covered in blood and shattered glass. The neighbor immediately called 911, struggling to convey the extent of the horror before them. I heard a gunshot, and when I came outside, I saw my neighbor in a terrible state. He's still alive, but he can't respond to me. We need an ambulance right away. Don't know who did this or why, but please hurry. As the ambulance raced towards the scene, police swarmed the scene. The neighbor was questioned, but the only lead they had was a silver Toyota Prius seen leaving the area after the shooting. It was a slim chance, but it was something for the police to work with. Meanwhile, Dan lay in his car, his face shattered by the bullet, and every second that ticked by was critical to his survival. The ambulance arrived 19 minutes later, but by then it was too late. But a grave error had been made. The dispatcher hadn't relayed the severity of the situation, and every second counted. Sadly, despite their best efforts, the medical team couldn't save him. It would never be known if the ambulance's delayed arrival played a role in his tragic fate. 14 hours after the tragic shooting, Dan took his last breath in the intensive care unit. The police were left with a perplexing case. A beloved family man with no known enemies had been ruthlessly murdered in his own driveway, and all they had to work with was the possibility of a silver Toyota Prius spotted near the scene. A memorial service was held in honor of Dan, and it was clear from the huge turnout of friends, family, and students that he was cherished by all who knew him. The police were at a dead end with no evidence or suspects. Their only lead was Dan's ex-wife, Wendy Adelson, who was brought in for questioning on the same day as the shooting. Though not under arrest, she was a person of interest. Wendy listened to a voicemail from a friend who was an estate agent as she entered the interview room, ready to answer the police's questions. As Wendy listened to the voicemail left by her friend, her heart sank. The message confirmed her worst fear. Something terrible had happened to Dan. The police were quick to fill her in, explaining that her ex-husband had been shot and was fighting for his life. Wendy was beside herself with emotion, tears streaming down her face as she struggled to process the news. Desperate for answers, Wendy informed the investigators that she had messaged Dan that morning and everything appeared to be fine. But the officers needed to establish her whereabouts at the time of the shooting before ruling her out of any inquiries. Wendy was more than willing to cooperate, but her grief was almost overwhelming. The thought of losing Dan, the father of her children, was too much to bear. Wendy was in shambles as she revealed to the investigator that she left her house at noon to run some errands, attempting to drive up her old street, only to find it blocked. She gasped in horror at the realization of what might have happened. When asked about any potential enemies of Dan, Wendy cried harder, eventually managing to choke out, "He sometimes rubbed people the wrong way, but I can't think of anyone who would do this to him." The investigator probed further, asking if Dan had any outstanding debts. Wendy, through her tears, admitted, "Well, he owes me money." The investigator seized upon this and questioned her, to which she responded with a solemn denial, "It wasn't me." Wendy's genuine shock and sorrow was palpable, and the officer handled the sensitive situation with care. But despite their conversation, the police were still left with no new leads. The police ruled out robbery as a motive for Dan's shooting, since no attempt was made to enter his home or steal his belongings. This left revenge as the only plausible reason, but revenge for what? Did Wendy have a point? Had Dan rubbed someone the wrong way? It was one thing to irritate someone, but to enrage them enough to take out a gun and shoot you in broad daylight was a whole different level. In a bid to gather information, the police decided to enlist the public's help. They made it clear that Dan was targeted and the attack was premeditated, not a random act of violence. A reward was offered immediately to anyone who could provide leads that would lead to an arrest and conviction. The reward for information on Dan's murder started at a mere $1,000, but as time passed and the case went cold, it increased to a whopping $25,000. And if that wasn't enough, an anonymous donor threw in an extra $100,000 reward on top of it all. The police were stumped, and they expanded their search for suspects. They talked to everyone, from Dan's students to his closest friends and family, but all they heard were glowing testimonials about Dan's character. No one had a clue as to why anyone would want to kill him. As days turned into months and months turned into a year, the police found themselves in a rut. The first 24 hours of any murder investigation are crucial, but that time had long passed. With no new leads, the police held a press conference on the one-year anniversary of Dan's murder, and for the first time, they released images of a silver Toyota Prius that might have been involved in the crime. The mystery surrounding Dan Markel's murder had left police stumped for years. Despite their efforts and a substantial reward, they were unable to find any leads or suspects. For a long time, the trail seemed to have gone cold in the murder case of Dan Markel. The police had waited a year before divulging important information about a silver Toyota Prius that could have been used by the killer. By the time they made a fresh appeal for leads, it seemed too late as the case remained open for another year with no progress. Whoever had committed the murder had all the time in the world to cover their tracks, leaving the chances of a breakthrough slim to none. But 2 years after Dan's death, a warrant was finally issued for first-degree murder against Sigfredo Garcia, age 34. While the police had refused to provide details about the arrest to protect their case, a probable cause affidavit was later released to the public after orders from the Leon County judge. The investigation into Dan Markel's murder had taken a startling turn. The police had uncovered evidence suggesting that Sigfredo Garcia wasn't acting alone. They believed he had an accomplice, Luis Rivera, and together they had traveled from Miami in a rented silver Toyota Prius. The police had tracked their movements as they bounced between motels, collecting cell phone data, toll collection records, and security camera footage from all over the area. The footage showed the pair following Dan Markel as he went about his daily routine, and it appeared they were planning his murder. But why would they target a man they seemingly had no connection to? The police believed this was a murder-for-hire case, and they were determined to get to the bottom of it. The truth was finally exposed. Garcia and Rivera were mere hired guns, paid to take out Dan Markel. But the source of their information was the most intriguing aspect of the case, an anonymous informant. The question remained, who had ordered the hit? The answer was about to shock everyone. Garcia and Rivera were not willing to take all the blame, and in their desperation, they decided to cooperate with the police. And what they revealed was shocking. The masterminds behind the murder were none other than Charlie and Donna Adelson, the brother and mother of Dan's ex-wife. It was hard to believe that these upstanding citizens, who ran a reputable dental practice called Adelson's Institute, could be involved in such a heinous crime. But as surprising as it was, this revelation alone was not enough to convict Charlie and Donna. The police were skeptical about the information provided by the two hitmen, knowing that they might be fabricating their story to save themselves from the murder charges. How could an esteemed dentist and his family be involved in a sinister plot with two hired killers from Miami? The missing link came in the form of a woman named Catherine Magbanua, who had a romantic relationship with Charlie Adelson, and was also the mother of 2 children with Garcia. Phone records revealed that Rivera had called Catherine right after the assassination of Dan Markel, indicating her involvement in the case. According to the hitmen and the Adelsons, they never met each other before. Catherine, who acted as the sole intermediary, received $100,000 for her services. The police discovered that Catherine had been making deposits worth tens of thousands of dollars in her bank account over the last year. The Adelsons were based in Miami, but Wendy lived in Tallahassee with Dan. Wendy wanted to move to Miami to be closer to her family, but Dan opposed it. He didn't use violence or threats, but instead went to court and obtained an order that prohibited Wendy from relocating with their children. The reason behind this was their previous divorce settlement that granted 50-50 custody. However, Dan's mother-in-law appeared to hold a grudge against him. This could be because Dan filed a motion that prevented Donna Adelson from spending unsupervised time with their children. His justification was the alleged abuse he received from her. Despite this, Donna's actions leading to Dan's murder were never justifiable. The murder had been meticulously planned long before Dan Markel filed the motion in court, but things were about to take a surprising turn. Luis Rivera, who was already serving time without bail on unrelated charges, reached out to investigators and offered to exchange information for a deal. Intrigued, the investigators agreed to re-interview him. Luis revealed his side of the story, claiming that he had no idea that the plan involved murder until he got into the car with Garcia. According to him, he was only informed that it was a drug robbery. When he found out about the plan to kill Dan Markel, he expressed his disapproval and suggested robbing the woman who was to pay them to do it instead. Despite being promised a payment of $35,000 each, Luis Rivera claimed that he didn't want to harm Dan Markel, a man he had never met and had nothing against, especially because he had 2 children. In fact, he had never even heard of him before until Garcia showed him a picture. While Rivera insisted that he had never heard of the Adelsons, he did mention a woman named Katie, short for Catherine, who he claimed was the mastermind behind the murder. Rivera stated that the reason he and Garcia were hired in the first place was that a woman wanted to regain full custody of her children. Although the Adelsons continued to deny any involvement in the killing, checks signed by Donna were found by the police, but it doesn't necessarily prove that she was behind Dan's murder. The checks that Donna Adelson wrote could have been for a variety of reasons, and it was not clear evidence that she was involved in Dan's murder. The FBI became involved in the case and set up a sting operation to try and catch the Adelson family. Charlie Adelson received phone calls from a man named Sandy, who threatened him and asked why Rivera was not being taken care of in prison and why his family was not being looked after on the outside. Charlie was frightened by the phone calls, but he managed to stay composed and not implicate himself. The FBI had hacked Charlie's phone to try to gather evidence against him, but their efforts had not yet been successful. In July 2016, a grand jury in Leon County indicted Garcia and Rivera on charges of first-degree murder. After Catherine's arrest, Rivera's charge was downgraded to second-degree murder, likely because of his cooperation and a guilty plea. He was already serving time for unrelated offenses and was given an additional 19 years for his role in Dan Markel's murder. Catherine and Sigfredo faced the same charges, and their trials were merged and held on October 19th. The defense claimed that Charlie Adelson had orchestrated the whole thing, promising a hefty $100,000 payout split between the 3 for the murder. Their motive? To ensure that Charlie's sister gained full custody of her children without Dan's interference. But wait, it gets better. During the trial, the prosecutors called upon an unexpected witness, Wendy Adelson's ex-boyfriend, Jeffrey Lacasse. Jeffrey Lacasse took the stand as a witness during a trial of Catherine and Sigfredo. He testified that Wendy had confided in him about her brother Charlie's plan to hire a hitman to kill Dan Markel. Wendy allegedly said Charlie had explored all options with regard to her problem, and that he was talking about getting a hitman to kill Professor Markel. She told me it would cost around $50,000. Catherine, who sometimes went by the name Katie, vehemently denied any involvement in the murder. Meanwhile, Sigfredo Garcia tried to shift the blame to his accomplice, Luis Rivera, who always maintained that it was Garcia who fired the fatal shot. Despite Garcia's defense, he was also found guilty and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 30 years for conspiracy, but indicated he appealed the sentence. The trial of Catherine had a dramatic twist when her charges were downgraded to second-degree murder, but the jury was unable to reach a verdict, leading to a mistrial. Her retrial began on May 16, 2022, lasting for 11 intense days. The jury this time around was more convinced, and on May 27th, Catherine was convicted of first-degree murder and solicitation to commit murder, resulting in a life sentence without the possibility of parole for the murder, and 30 additional years for solicitation and conspiracy. With the three main culprits behind bars, the case seemed to be closed, but it was far from over. A fresh arrest was made on April 21, 2022, when police stormed the home of Charlie Adelson, charging him with first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and solicitation to commit murder. The discovery of audio recordings between Catherine and Charlie discussing the plot to kill Dan Markel sent shockwaves through the community. As the case nears its end, many unanswered questions still linger. For instance, how much did Wendy Adelson truly know? Testimonies from Rivera, Garcia, and Magbanua all suggest that Dan Markel's murder was carried out to secure Wendy's custody of her children. When we add this to Wendy's conversation with Jeffrey Lacasse, it raises the possibility of her deeper involvement. However, it's important to note that there is no concrete evidence to support this, and Wendy has not faced any charges. Then there's Donna Adelson, who signed off on several checks worth thousands of dollars. It was undoubtedly proven that she held a deep grudge against her former son-in-law and wanted to cause him as much misery as possible. As for Charlie Adelson, he's set to stand trial in April 2023. But with so many unanswered questions, it remains to be seen if the full truth will ever come to light. The trial may be ending soon, but it feels like the case is far from over. The question remains, what was Donna Adelson's involvement in the murder plot? Did she just sign the checks, or was she more involved? Despite suspicions, there is no concrete evidence against her yet. It's clear that the three convicted individuals couldn't have acted alone. Two of them had never even met the victim. All roads lead to Charlie Adelson, who will be the only family member to stand trial in April. Will he finally reveal the full extent of his involvement when faced with a life sentence? The truth is still out there, waiting to be uncovered. As this twisted case unfolded, a web of deceit and criminality was exposed, but amidst the chaos, it's important not to forget the victim at the center of it all. Dan Markel, a man with no enemies and a heart full of love for his children, was ruthlessly taken from this world by hired hitmen. He fought tooth and nail in court to protect his sons, but tragically, his efforts were not enough. Dan's legacy lives on through his extensive legal writings and the countless students he inspired. However, his sons will forever feel the loss of their devoted father. Rest in peace, Dan Markel. This case will leave you with many unanswered questions. Please like, comment, and subscribe to our channel for more shocking cases like this. Don't forget to hit the notification bell to stay updated on our latest releases.